Usually when we talk about building something massive, like a skyscraper or a suspension bridge or, I
Hmm.
don't know, a monument, there's this there's this total expectation of visibility.
Right, yeah, people want to see it.
Exactly. You stand on the sidewalk, you see the steel beams going up, you watch the cranes moving, the glass catching the sun, and you just point at it and say, there it is, that's the work.
I mean, it's just human nature, isn't it?
Why?
We're completely captivated by measurable progress.
Yeah.
Like the stuff right before our eyes, the
Yeah.
things we can actually photograph and celebrate.
It's clean and it's obvious.
Mm.
But then, if you look closely at what actually keeps that skyscraper standing when, say, a Category 5 hurricane rolls through, or when the earth just fundamentally shifts beneath it,
That's a whole different story.
right, suddenly you're not looking at the gleaming glass or the spire on top anymore. You're looking at things buried deep underground. You are looking at the rebar, the massive concrete footings, the
Mhm.
hidden architecture that, frankly, nobody ever claps for and nobody ever takes a picture of.
No, they don't. And it is the absolute definition of unseen, load-bearing reality. Like the structure only survives the elements because of what is deliberately hidden beneath the surface.
Wow, yeah. Deliberately hidden.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is just the sheer volume of engineering that goes into those invisible parts. I mean, in some of the world's tallest buildings, you have these massive tuned mass dampers.
Wait, what are those?
They're these giant, heavy pendulums, basically, hidden inside the top floors, and they swing against the wind to keep the building from snapping in half.
That is wild.
Right, but you never see them. You just trust that they are doing the work.
And so today, we are doing a deep dive into the exact same hidden architecture, but for human movements. We're looking at this fascinating, really theology-rich source document called 010 Prayer and Financial Support Networks.
It's such a good text.
It really is, and we're using it to figure out why passion, why talent, and why even a genuine burning calling are never, ever enough to sustain a long-term mission.
No, they really aren't.
We are unpacking the hidden architecture of prayer, of financial partnership, and community that actually makes endurance possible.
Because the truth we are confronting here is that the initial spark of any great endeavor, well, it's rarely the thing that sustains it through the decades.
Yeah, that initial hype.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There is a vast, often really painful difference between launching a mission and actually carrying a mission over the long haul.
Which connects so directly to the realities that you, the listener, probably face every day. I mean, whether you are launching a business, trying to build a community movement, or just, fascinated by how great undertakings actually survive what our source material calls the long middle.
Oh, the long middle. That phrase is perfect.
It's so good. Understanding this invisible infrastructure, it just completely reframes how you view independence. It changes the psychology of asking for help, and it challenges our cultural definition of what true partnership really is.
So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. Because the foundational premise we have to grapple with first is the absolute dismantling of the myth of the lone operator.
Yes. And this is where the analysis hits incredibly hard right out of the gate. I mean, it basically argues that a great many ministries, nonprofits, sweeping social movements, they begin with this intense fire.
Right. Tons of energy.
Exactly. The founders have these strong intentions. The vision is perfectly clear. The need in the world is undeniable. But then they eventually crash.
And the central question is why?
Right. Why do well-intentioned, highly capable, genuinely called people burn out and fail so predictably? And the answer provided by the text is that they operate on a deeply flawed psychological and spiritual assumption.
And what's the assumption?
They assume that if a calling is genuine,
Yeah.
if the cause is righteous, then the provision, the support, and the endurance will just magically materialize without any organized structure.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the text calls it the myth of the self-sustaining calling. And it's such a dangerous trap because honestly, it sounds so incredibly noble.
It does. It sounds very spiritual.
Right. It sounds spiritual to say, well, I have the vision, so everything else will just naturally fall into place. The universe will provide.
But it doesn't work that way.
No. The reality is that a calling not carried by tangible partnership and faithful stewardship will just eventually collapse under its own weight. The work might begin with conviction, but it is sustained by connection.
And that brings us to that grinding reality you mentioned, the long middle.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
Well, this phrase perfectly captures the unglamorous, everyday mechanics of any long-term mission. because momentum cannot fix the long middle.
Right.
The initial adrenaline of a launch always wears off. The launch party ends, the initial big donations sort of dry up, the novelty fades, and then you are left with the crushing, ordinary weight of reality.
Just the daily grind.
Exactly. We're talking about the mechanics of survival. Invoices that need to be paid on the first of the month, travel costs, rent, sudden emergency needs.
And don't forget the relational stuff.
Oh, huge. The profound strain of cultural adaptation, if you are, say, operating in a foreign field, and the relational friction that inevitably comes from living and working under constant pressure.
It's the quiet exhaustion that comes when someone tries to carry a massive assignment with just human resources alone. And, that concept is staggering to me because it translates perfectly into modern secular life, too.
Oh, absolutely it does.
Like, think about the modern solopreneur or the hustle culture myth we see plastered all over social media.
Yeah, the whole grind set thing.
Yes, you know the exact aesthetic. The 4 a.m. wake-ups, the ice baths, the idea that you have to build your empire entirely by yourself. We have this cultural narrative that asking for help or needing a robust support system is somehow a sign of weakness.
Like you aren't trying hard enough.
Exactly. Like it's a lack of competence or
Yeah.
proof that you just aren't cut out for it.
It's the exact same psychological trap, really. It's just wrapped in the vocabulary of modern capitalism rather than theology.
The lone operator mindset tells you that if you need help, you aren't strong enough. It isolates the individual by making self-sufficiency into this ultimate moral virtue.
Right. But, okay, let me push back on this for a second, especially given the theological nature of our source text.
I'm sure for it.
Doesn't setting up all these support structures, budgets, donor newsletters, organized prayer teams, regular check-ins, doesn't explicitly asking for help imply a lack of faith?
That is very common pushback.
I mean, if someone is truly called by the divine to do something, shouldn't they just trust that things will work out organically? Isn't organizing all of this infrastructure just, relying on human mechanics instead of divine providence?
It's a fair question, but it's one that gets dismantled masterfully when you look at the historical and biblical blueprints in the text.
Okay, how so?
Well, interdependence isn't a sign of weakness or a lack of faith. Interdependence is actually the fundamental design. God calls, yes, but he also commands structure.
Give me an example.
Consider the ancient tabernacle in the wilderness. It wasn't built through spiritual enthusiasm alone.
Right, they didn't just pray it into existence.
Exactly. It required massive logistical organization.
Yeah.
It required specific materials, highly skilled craftsmanship, detailed architectural plans, and the willing, organized contribution of the entire community.
Wow, yeah.
So the lone operator mindset actually breeds pride, not faith.
Yeah.
It secretly suggests that meeting the community is somehow beneath you.
Which inevitably leads to exhaustion and, honestly, spiritual distortion. I mean, when a leader tries to carry it all, they start making decisions based on sheer survival rather than wisdom.
They become completely reactive.
Right, reactive instead of proactive. They start hiding their needs because admitting a deficit feels like admitting failure.
Yeah.
And they just slowly hollow out from the inside.
Exactly. And this leads to a really profound psychological insight from the text. Isolation is the ultimate threat. Isolation breeds compromise. When you cut a worker off from their community, from accountability, and from material support, two specific things happen. First, pride grows.
Because no one is there to check them.
Right. There is no one close enough to challenge their assumptions or refine their vision. And second, deep discouragement takes root. Because there is no one close enough to strengthen their heart when the inevitable failures actually happen.
So the work becomes unstable not because the initial calling was false, but because the structure meant to hold that calling was just non-existent.
Precisely.
The text has this chilling summary. It says, the enemy often does not need to destroy a ministry directly. He only needs to isolate the servant.
That line is so powerful.
It really is. It's a perfect summary of how movements actually die. They don't usually go out in a blaze of scandalous glory. They die of quiet starvation in a corner.
Yep. And if isolation is the great destroyer and a thin support structure is what ultimately collapses a mission, we have to look at how the early architects of these massive movements operated.
Because they didn't have the internet.
No, they didn't have mass communication or wire transfers or algorithmic marketing, yet they built networks that lasted millennia.
Which takes us right into the ancient blueprint of partnership. And this is centered around a really fascinating Greek concept that changes everything about how we view charity and support.
We are talking about the concept of koinonia.
Yes, koinonia.
To really understand this, the text dives deep into the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians, specifically chapter 4. And we often read this passage in modern times as just a polite, ancient thank you note for a financial donation.
Right, like thanks for the $20.
Exactly. But historically and theologically, it wasn't just a polite acknowledgement. It was a radical theological revelation.
Okay, unpack that.
Koinonia translates to partnership or fellowship, but we have to totally strip away our modern, shallow understanding of those words. Today, fellowship means having coffee and donuts after an event.
Yeah, casual chatting.
Right. But in the ancient world, koinonia meant belonging together in a way that created profound mutual obligation, mutual joy, and shared responsibility. It was literally a binding of fates.
And the way this passage functions in the text is that it completely dismantles three very specific modern distortions we have about financial support and charity.
Yes, let's walk through those, because they really challenge our default assumptions about how giving works.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first major distortion that gets dismantled is the idea that financial support is somehow secondary to real ministry.
Oh yeah, we definitely do this.
We operate with this false hierarchy in our heads. We tend to think that preaching or being on the ground or doing the public-facing work is the spiritual part,
Right.
and that writing the check, managing the spreadsheet, or doing the administrative logistics is just the practical, unspiritual part.
Yeah, but Philippians refuses this split entirely. The text points out that the giving is fellowship in the gospel. The financial gift is not something that happens outside the ministry to keep it going. The gift is an active participation inside the ministry itself.
It's a great distinction.
It's like saying the engine is the real car and the fuel line is just a practical accessory. I mean, you don't go anywhere without both functioning perfectly together.
That's a great analogy, and that leads to the second distortion we have to tackle, which is this deeply ingrained idea that the supported worker is a beggar.
Yes, the false humility or the shame associated with asking for funding.
Right. When Paul receives support, he doesn't ask as a desperate dependent trying to preserve his fragile ego. He receives as a steward entrusted with sacred work.
He knows the vital difference between expressing a genuine need and operating out of shame.
Precisely. The worker is not a beggar, and humility doesn't have to mean humiliation. There is a real dignity in the exchange because both parties are submitting to a higher purpose.
Which brings us to the third distortion. And honestly, I think this is probably the most common one in our modern nonprofit and charitable culture.
Absolutely.
It's the assumption that the church or the individual supporter is just a passive audience.
False spectatorship. We treat giving like buying a ticket to a show.
Yeah.
You pay the admission and then you sit in the bleachers and watch the professional do all the work. But Paul's deep gratitude to his supporters makes absolutely zero sense if they are just an audience.
Right. They are active participants.
Yes. Their financial partnership is operational. They are intimately, strategically involved in the movement itself, bearing the exact same spiritual weight as the person on the front lines.
And here's where it gets really interesting. To fully grasp how radical this is, we have to look at the harsh realities of the first century Mediterranean world.
It was a very different time.
Completely. We are talking about an era with zero donor portals. There are no institutional safety nets, no GoFundMe pages, no nonprofit tax brackets.
None of it.
And travel wasn't just inconvenient. It was violently dangerous. Shipwrecks, bandits, disease. When a worker went out into the field, they were entirely exposed. Communication took months.
Literally months.
So in that world, giving wasn't just a nice gesture to help an organization hit its quarterly budget. Giving literally meant the difference between life and death.
It meant baseline survival.
Yeah.
And yet, despite that absolute material dependence, Paul refuses to let that dependence turn into materialism or manipulation.
Right.
He never resorts to saying, your gift guarantees my success, or if you don't give, God's work will fail.
Yeah.
He anchors his confidence entirely in the divine reality that stands behind the gift.
Maintaining his autonomy while deeply honoring the giver.
Yes.
And we have to talk about the massive cultural subversion happening here. Because in the Roman culture of the first century, the entire society ran on a pervasive, heavily codified system of patronage.
The patronage system, yes. This is crucial context.
If a wealthy Roman patron gave you a gift, or funded your work, or bailed you out of debt, you instantly became their client. And that meant you were bound by very real, though invisible, strings.
The salutatio is the perfect example of this.
I'll tell him about the salutatio.
So every morning, clients were expected to gather at the home of their wealthy patron at dawn. They had to greet him, essentially flatter him, and wait to see what favors or tasks he required of them that day.
It was basically a social protection racket.
It really was.
You owed them absolute loyalty, you had to vote for who they wanted, you had to cheer for them in public, and they essentially owned a piece of your autonomy. The power dynamics were completely asymmetrical.
You were the subordinate, forever trying to pay off a social debt that could never truly be cleared.
Exactly. It was the strict accounting language of the ancient world, like, I give to you, therefore you are now in my debt, socially, politically, and personally. I hold leverage over you.
Right.
And what happens here is that Paul takes this Roman accounting language, he actually uses the phrase the matter of giving and receiving, and he subverts the entire system from the inside out.
It's brilliant.
But he absolutely refuses to let the kingdom of God turn into a Roman patronage system. He refuses to let the donor become the master and the minister become the subordinate client.
Because giving in this new paradigm isn't a transaction that buys leverage. It's an act of worship. It removes the leash completely.
That distinction cannot be overstated. When giving becomes an act of worship toward God rather than a transaction between humans, the power dynamic just evaporates.
It completely vanishes.
Oh.
And the text we are analyzing warns heavily against possessive giving, which is basically the toxic modern equivalent of Roman patronage. We'll dissect that a bit later.
Yeah, we definitely need to get to that.
But the antidote to possessive giving is right here. Paul tells his supporters that he isn't desperately seeking the physical gift itself, but rather he is seeking the fruit that increases to your credit.
Let's pause and unpack that mechanism, fruit that increases to your credit. What is actually happening psychologically and spiritually to the donor in that moment?
Well, what's happening is spiritual transformation for the giver. In the world's standard economy, what you give away, you lose. It is simple, painful subtraction. My bank account goes down so yours can go up.
Right, a zero-sum game.
Exactly. But in the ecosystem of koinonia, what is given in faith is transformed. It becomes fruit. It accumulates as spiritual treasure and character within the person who gave it.
Wow.
The giver doesn't own the mission, and the worker isn't a vendor providing a spiritual service for a fee. The act of giving actively forms the soul of the donor.
It loosens their own grip on anxiety. It breaks the idolatry of possession, the illusion that our money is what keeps us safe. It teaches the donor how to trust. It is an offering that rises upward, not just a lateral transfer of funds from one human to another.
Precisely. The donor isn't just sustaining someone else's ministry. The donor is being fundamentally reshaped by the discipline of generosity.
Yeah.
And this beautiful, non-transactional, interdependent relationship doesn't just happen by accident. You don't just stumble into this kind of healthy ecosystem through clever organizational management or good HR policies.
No, it requires a solid theological foundation. It is actually modeled after the very nature of the divine.
Which brings us to the Trinitarian ecology of mission.
Yes. If the ideal partnership rejects human power dynamics and embraces perfect interdependence, what is the actual blueprint for that? The text points to the Trinity.
And this is where the abstract theology becomes an intensely practical organizational blueprint. The core argument here is that Christian partnership is a direct reflection of the Trinity.
Right.
God is not solitary. He's triune. The Father sends, the Son accomplishes, the Spirit empowers. They are distinct persons with distinct roles. They are perfectly united in will and purpose. And here is the crucial part.
What's that?
There is absolutely zero competition between them.
Distinct roles, perfectly united, zero competition. I mean, that is the holy grail of team dynamics.
It really is.
But humans are wired for competition. We are wired for ego, for credit, for securing our piece of the pie. How do you map that perfect divine reality onto messy human partnerships where resources always feel so scarce?
By fundamentally changing how the participants view their roles. When the church functions as a body, where each member supplies exactly what the others cannot, it mirrors that divine pattern.
Okay, so breaking that down.
The person who packs up their family and goes to a foreign country.
Yeah.
The person who organizes the sending logistics. The person who spends hours in intercessory prayer. The person who writes the massive check.
Yeah.
They're not performing separate competing activities.
Yeah.
They are participating in a single divine movement.
And this is where the ecosystem metaphor comes into play in the text, which just makes this abstract idea so visceral.
It's a beautiful metaphor.
Imagine a massive ancient tree. When we walk past it, we look at the visible branches stretching into the sky. We see the green leaves, we see the fruit, and we praise the tree. We take pictures of the canopy.
We love the visible part.
We do. But all of that visible, celebrated growth depends entirely on invisible roots. The mineral density of the soil, the depth of the water table, the hidden microscopic web of life beneath the surface.
Everything underground.
Right. If you chop off the unseen roots, the tree might look fine for a little while, running on stored energy. But its strength is gone, and eventually the first strong wind will topple it.
Because the ecosystem is entirely interdependent. In the context of a mission or a movement, the visible branches are the public figures.
The missionary, the church planter.
Exactly. The charismatic public speaker, the founder of the nonprofit. They get the applause. But the roots are the praying grandmother who never leaves her hometown but intercedes daily.
Oh, I love that.
The roots are the quiet business owner who anonymously underwrites the travel costs. The roots are the small, modest congregation that faithfully sends a portion of their very limited resources every single month without ever asking for a plaque with their name on it.
And the paradigm shift here is that the person funding the journey, the person praying in the dark, and the person preaching in the remote village are doing the exact same kingdom labor.
Yes, there is zero distinction in value.
Which is wild because we are so heavily conditioned by our culture to rank importance by visibility.
Oh, constantly.
The person on the stage with the microphone is doing the real work. And the person balancing the budget or praying in their living room is just in a support role. We treat them like the B team.
But this ecosystem model completely obliterates that hierarchy. It insists that heaven does not measure importance the way human platforms do. Heaven does not confuse visibility with value.
That is so freeing.
It really is. It completely levels the playing field and frees people from the exhausting lie that only public, widely recognized work matters.
And there's a stunning historical example of this ecosystem in action in the book of Acts, chapter 13, looking at the early church in Antioch.
Yes, the Antioch example.
It perfectly illustrates how the roots feed the branches long before the branches even emerge. In Antioch, they didn't start a massive global mission by launching a glossy fundraising campaign or hiring a consulting firm or, printing brochures.
No, they didn't do any of that. They started with shared devotion. The environment was characterized by worship and fasting.
Yeah.
The prophets and teachers gathered not to strategize a launch, but to listen. And it is in that specific environment of communal devotion that the Holy Spirit speaks and says to set apart Barnabas and Saul for the work.
So the calling isn't a solitary light bulb moment.
Not at all. It is discerned in community.
The commissioning comes after the corporate discernment. It wasn't an isolated individual running into the room saying, I have a grand vision, I'm the leader, everyone follow me and fund my idea.
Exactly. It was the body acting as an ecosystem. The community birthed the mission. The roots pushed the branches upward.
Antioch became a sending church, not just because they had excess money, but because they had profound spiritual alignment. They knew how to pray together, how to discern the divine will together, and how to release their best people.
Which proves that true apostolic work begins best not in isolation, but in a praying, discerning, and deeply connected community.
So think about your own ecology for a second, you listening to this. Are you constantly, exhaustingly striving to be the visible branches? Are you burning yourself out trying to produce leaves and fruit all by yourself, craving that visibility?
It's an exhausting way to live.
It really is. Or are you perhaps perfectly built to be the vital, invisible root system for someone else's calling? Are you the soil? Are you the water table? Because your hidden faithfulness, your unglamorous consistency, might be the exact load-bearing infrastructure someone else needs to survive the storms.
It is a profound shift in identity.
Definitely.
But we have to pivot to the practical mechanics, because managing the tangible resources within this ecosystem, the actual soil and water, the money, requires something incredibly difficult for human beings to master.
Oh, here we go.
It requires absolute integrity and a deeply learned, highly disciplined contentment.
Money. We have to talk about money, because as our source material makes abundantly clear, nothing exposes the human heart quite like financial resources.
Oh, it exposes everything.
Money exposes what we trust, what we fear, what we desire, and ultimately what we worship.
It is arguably the most revealing force in human life. And because of that, the management of money within this support ecosystem cannot be treated casually.
No.
It cannot be hidden in the dark or handled with a handshake and a promise. It must be disciplined into holiness through rigorous, transparent, accountable stewardship.
Discipline into holiness. I love that phrase from the text because it means that budgets, spreadsheets, financial audits, and quarterly reports aren't just unspiritual bureaucratic chores that distract from the real ministry.
Right.
They are theological instruments. They are tools of integrity.
Precisely. A leader who cannot speak clearly, accurately, and honestly about money should not be trusted to steward it. Transparency protects the conscience of everyone involved.
Yeah, it honors the sacrifice of the giver by showing exactly where the resources went. It protects the mission from scandal.
And it prevents the kind of lingering suspicion that destroys trust faster than anything else.
Absolutely. And speaking of how we view resources, there is a massively misunderstood verse that constantly gets thrown around when discussing provision and endurance. Philippians 4:13.
Oh yes, I can do all things through him who strengthens me.
Right. If you walk into literally any commercial gym, you will see this verse painted on the wall. You see it stitched onto athletic gear, written on the shoes of professional athletes, printed on motivational coffee mugs.
It's everywhere.
We have completely hijacked it as a slogan for limitless personal ambition, conquering our goals, and pushing past our physical limits.
It has been turned into a banner for human conquest and ego.
Oh.
But if you look at the historical and literary context, Paul didn't write it from a place of limitless self-confidence after a massive victory.
No, he didn't.
He wrote it from a dark, damp Roman prison.
Yeah.
If you look at the verses immediately preceding it, Paul is talking about experiencing both wild abundance and desperate starvation.
Yeah.
He explicitly says he has learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need.
So the all things in that verse isn't about winning a championship or securing a massive round of venture capital or building a global organization.
Not at all.
It's about enduring. It's about possessing a learned contentment that keeps you stable in wildly fluctuating, uncontrollable circumstances.
And why is contentment so utterly vital to a support network? Because contentment is the only psychological and spiritual mechanism that protects the worker from fear and protects the supporter from control.
Okay, let's break that down, starting with the worker.
Sure.
If a leader or missionary is not deeply anchored in contentment, if their identity and sense of safety are completely tied to their monthly funding goals or the size of their donor base, they will inevitably panic when the resources drop.
And when panic sets in, manipulation follows.
Right. They will start crafting newsletters that subtly exaggerate the crisis. They will use emotional coercion to force people to give. They confuse their own appetite for security with a genuine ministry need.
Exactly. And on the flip side, contentment is the only thing that protects the supporter from possessive giving.
Ah, here we are.
We touched on the Roman patronage system earlier, and possessive giving is basically its modern organizational equivalent.
Right.
It is the toxic, often subconscious belief that because you gave a significant amount of money, you now own influence, access, or control over the mission.
Yeah, that happens so much.
A supporter who gives in order to dictate outcomes or to feel powerful will eventually weaponize their generosity. If the leader makes a decision the donor disagrees with, the donor pulls the funding. The gift was always a leash.
Wow. Giving ceases to be a leash and becomes a bond of grace only when both parties, the one writing the check and the one cashing it, are anchored in a contentment that doesn't rely on the transaction to validate their worth.
That's very well said.
But, you know, there is another group of people deeply, profoundly affected by this financial and spiritual ecosystem, and they are almost always the silent casualties.
Yes, this is such an important part of the text.
Because, wait, we're praising all these heroic sacrifices of the visionary founder, but I can't stop thinking about the missionary's spouse and kids.
Right.
Aren't they basically being drafted into a war they didn't sign up for? We romanticize the lone missionary living out of a backpack on a shoestring budget for the cause. But what about the people actually living in their house?
This is an absolutely critical point, and our source text addresses it with striking firmness. It states plainly that families are not invisible collateral.
I love that phrasing, invisible collateral.
Right. A kingdom culture, or an organizational culture, that ignores the reality of families will eventually become deeply unstable and morally compromised.
Yeah.
Spouses cannot be expected to just silently absorb all of the leader's unmanaged stress, financial panic, and emotional absence. And children cannot be treated as mere props in a mission story to elicit sympathy from donors.
The home is not a distraction from kingdom work. It is one of the first places where kingdom faithfulness is tested. That line from the text is a massive indictment of the kind of relentless, boundaryless ministry culture that burns out families in the name of spiritual zeal.
It really is.
If you lose your family while trying to save the world, you have fundamentally failed the assignment.
It is a profound failure of structure. A strong, healthy support network actively honors domestic realities. It ensures there is enough financial stability so the family isn't living in perpetual, unnecessary anxiety about groceries or medical bills.
Right, it provides emotional breathing room.
Exactly. When a supporter gives with this holistic view in mind, they aren't just funding a project. They might literally be helping a child stay in a stable school environment or allowing a spouse to get the rest they need.
Preventing the entire family unit from collapsing under the immense pressure of the long middle.
Yes.
So, if money and physical resources are the bloodstream of this ecosystem, keeping everything moving and alive, there is another element that serves as the very oxygen of the mission, and that is prayer.
Prayer. Yeah.
But we have to be very careful here because we aren't talking about thoughts and prayers as a cultural cliche or a polite sign-off in an email. We are talking about prayer treated as actual load-bearing infrastructure.
And this brings us to perhaps the most vital mechanical insight of the entire analysis. Prayer is not the decorative curtain hung around the ministry to make it look spiritual to the outside world.
No.
Prayer is the engine room. It is the place where the actual power is generated.
The text makes the argument that a ministry without a robust prayer infrastructure might still look incredibly busy and successful on the surface. It might have flawless marketing, massive attendance, perfectly executed events, a huge social media presence.
It can look very impressive.
Right. But inwardly, it slowly becomes spiritually thin, it drifts, it loses its sensitivity to the divine, it begins to rely purely on human cleverness, and it basically becomes mechanical. It has the form of a movement, but the power is gone.
And to prevent that mechanical drift, we have to understand the difference between two very distinct types of prayer outlined in the text: crisis prayer and covenant prayer.
The psychology behind this is so fascinating. Let's start with crisis prayer. It's like pulling a fire alarm. A sudden crisis hits, funding drops by 50%, someone gets a terrifying medical diagnosis, a visa is denied, and suddenly everyone is urgently, passionately praying. And fire alarms are absolutely necessary. You need them when the building is burning.
Of course.
But here's the catch. Human beings actually love crisis giving and crisis praying because it triggers a massive dopamine hit.
It does. It feels heroic to rush in and save the day.
But you cannot live your daily life constantly pulling the fire alarm. It causes adrenal fatigue in your supporters.
That's incredibly accurate. Crisis prayer is inherently reactive. Covenant prayer, on the other hand, is the steady, disciplined, continuous pulse of remembrance.
It isn't glamorous.
No, it doesn't provide a massive dopamine rush at all. It is the boring, structural necessity of daily intercession. Covenant prayer is the seismic damper in the building.
Right, back to the skyscraper.
Yes, it is the infrastructure that absorbs the shocks, prevents the fire from starting in the first place, or ensures that when the heat does come, the building can withstand it without collapsing.
And to build this covenant prayer, it requires actual organization. It can't just be an open invitation to, please pray for us. The text provides a literal structural blueprint, breaking a prayer network down into 3 distinct load-bearing layers.
Yes.
Let's methodically walk through those 3 layers, because this is the tactical advice every leader actually needs.
The first layer is the core circle. This is a very small, deeply intimate group of intercessors.
Yeah.
The emphasis here is entirely on faithfulness and confidentiality, not size.
So, not a newsletter list.
Definitely not. These aren't your massive monthly email blast people. These are the few people who know the deep, unvarnished, often ugly realities of the mission.
The messy stuff.
Right. They pray for high-stakes, specific things that the public might never see. They pray for doctrinal clarity so the leader doesn't drift, for relational unity among the core team, because internal conflict destroys more missions than external pressure.
Oh, 100%.
They pray for protection against unseen opposition, and for raw courage when fear sets in. They stand watch consistently.
So the core circle is deep, intimate, and carries the heaviest emotional and spiritual burdens. They know the leader's actual flaws. Okay, what is the second layer?
The second layer is the broader support circle. This layer naturally widens the field. It includes supporting churches, extended families, former colleagues, and friends who receive regular, curated updates.
Got it.
This circle is vital because a mission isn't meant to be carried by a tiny elite group forever. The wider body needs a way to participate and share the load. But, and this is a critical point of failure for many leaders, this broader circle requires extreme clarity and context to pray intelligently.
Right. It's like giving someone a highly detailed topographic map instead of just patting them on the back and saying, drive safely.
Exactly.
If I just say to my broader circle, please pray for my new business, That is so vague that it requires almost no engagement. But if I say, pray for the meeting on Tuesday at 10 a.m. with the zoning board because we are facing specific coordinated resistance regarding our building permits and we need favor with the local commissioner, now you have a map. You can pray with precision. You can anticipate the outcome.
And that specificity is actually an act of love and respect toward the supporter.
Yeah.
It treats them as an adult partner, giving them real burdens to carry rather than treating them like a child who only needs the happy highlights.
Yeah.
And even more importantly, that specific communication helps interpret the mission for the supporter. If they know exactly what the team is facing, they can recognize a delayed project not as a massive failure of leadership, but perhaps as divine protection from a bad partnership.
Oh, that's good. They can view a closed door as a necessary redirection. It expands the moral and spiritual imagination of the people praying.
It really does. And then we have the third layer. It's the mobilizing circle. Now, this isn't an everyday occurrence. This circle is activated specifically for strategic thresholds and major turning points.
Like crisis mode. Sort of, but more strategic.
Mm-hmm.
It's when a ministry is facing a massive launch, an existential crisis, a severe legal threat, or a major transition into a new country. And the leaders blow the trumpet, calling the entire broader church network to gather for strategic corporate prayer.
Wow.
It's the layer of gathered momentum, focusing massive spiritual resources on a single pressure point.
Core, broader, and mobilizing. That is a robust architecture. But there is one final crucial element to this prayer infrastructure, and it completely flips the script on how we view leadership. The reciprocity in prayer.
Yes. The moral weight of mutual intercession.
It is the ultimate safeguard against arrogance. The leader must pray for the supporter.
They have to.
We always think of the supporters praying for the heroic leader on the front lines. The flow of spiritual energy is always assumed to be pushing upward toward the person on stage.
Always.
But if that prayer only flows one way, if the leader is only ever receiving prayer, receiving money, receiving encouragement, and never taking the time to genuinely intercede for the people funding and supporting them, the relationship rots. It becomes exploitative.
Yes, it becomes strictly utilitarian.
Because it treats the supporter merely as a resource extraction point. But this reciprocity, the leader actively praying for the donor, is what turns a functional partnership into true, enduring friendship.
Yeah.
Think about the beauty of that exchange. When the frontline missionary in a dangerous country is earnestly praying for the small-town congregation's youth group retreat back home, and that congregation is earnestly praying for the missionary's language learning.
They are sharing life.
Exactly. The supporter is no longer just a walking checkbook. They are a brother or sister. The leader is no longer just a distant, unapproachable hero. They are a fellow servant with a shared stake in the kingdom. It completely restores the moral order of the gospel.
So when you look at the whole picture, when you stack the Trinitarian ecology of zero competition, the radical subversion of Roman patronage and possessive giving, the disciplined contentment that refuses to manipulate, and this deeply layered reciprocal prayer infrastructure.
What you get is endurance.
Yes. The measure of success isn't the loud, flashy launch. It isn't the hype. Hype burns brightly, but it burns out quickly. Covenant keeps showing up on a random Tuesday when no one is watching.
Right.
The true measure of a mission's success is quiet, unbreakable endurance over the long middle.
Because a ministry built on this specific kind of hidden architecture can survive the inevitable disappointments. It can survive leadership transitions, vicious external criticism, financial droughts, and long seasons of total obscurity.
Yeah.
It outlasts the cultural moment because it is deeply embedded in a living, breathing network of covenant love.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started by completely shattering the myth of the lone operator, that toxic, pervasive idea that a genuine calling means you have to suffer and build alone.
We really unpacked that.
We did. We looked closely at how giving and receiving isn't just a practical transaction to pay the bills, but a sacred act of worship that subverts worldly power dynamics and actively transforms the soul of the giver. We explored the divine blueprint of the ecosystem, where the root and the branch hold the exact same value. And we just broke down the layered, load-bearing infrastructure of prayer that serves as the indestructible engine room for any lasting endeavor.
And the ultimate takeaway from all of this is that real strength does not come from denying our fundamental need for help.
Absolutely not.
Real strength comes from fully embracing our interdependence. The mission only outlasts the builder when the builder has the humility to allow themselves to be carried by a community.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. We spend so much of our lives, especially in today's hyper-individualized culture, frantically trying to build platforms that make us visible.
Always trying to be seen.
We want to be the branches. We want to be the bright green leaves catching the sunlight, swaying where everyone can see us and applaud our growth. But if the truest, most enduring power in any human movement comes from the hidden, invisible intercessors, the people faithfully holding the ropes in the dark, the unseen roots buried deep underground, what would happen if you decided to change your focus?
What if you dedicated a portion of your life, your resources, your actual daily routine to being the invisible infrastructure for someone else's dream? What if your greatest, most lasting legacy is a fruit that increases on someone else's visible tree?
It is a question that challenges the very core of how we measure a successful, meaningful life.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep learning, stay curious, and remember, the next time you look at a towering skyscraper standing firm while the wind howls against it, don't just admire the gleaming glass. Think about the concrete, the deep footings, and the rebar buried in the dark, holding the whole thing up against the storm. See you next time.